Josh here. We're talking all about tomato pruning today. So if you want to join, please jump on this live and we'll answer any questions you've got. We've got an indeterminate tomato here we're going to talk about, and we're also going to talk about determinate tomatoes. So it's all about tomato pruning. I've got my Vigo Garden tomato planter here. This is a yellow pear, which is an indeterminate variety. And we're going to talk about the difference between determinate and indeterminate first. So I'm going to let this guy just sort of flop around. There's actually this nifty contraption that goes on top. I took it off so y'all could see what I'm doing. But we've got this tomato, which is a little bit droopy right now, but we're going to get it propped up. And let's start with the two different types of tomatoes. So tomatoes come in two flavors, no pun intended, and that is determinate and indeterminate. So welcome. If you're just joining, we're talking all about tomato pruning today. So determinate varieties are those that grow more as a bush, right? And they have a determined end, meaning they get to this bush shape and they fruit almost all at once. Everything ripens all at once. And then indeterminate varieties, which is what we have here, will continue to grow and grow as a vine, and they'll go on and on and on, and they will just fruit here, they'll fruit up here, and that fruit will ripen, and then later this fruit will ripen, and you could have by the end of the season a 10 or 12 foot long tomato. So first things first, you need to understand, do I have a determinate tomato or an indeterminate? Now you can look that up online. You can say, okay, aroma's determinate. This yellow pear here is an indeterminate. So you got to know which type you have before we get into pruning. All right, next thing we need to talk about is tomato makeup, right? We want to talk about what are all the different parts of a tomato plant. Pretty straightforward. You've got the primary stem here, and this is your main support stem. Off of that, you've got some leaves that are forming. We've got a little flower cluster up here, and this is called the axil. This is where the stem meets its branch, and out of that you get these things called suckers. Okay, don't be a sucker. This is a real term. Okay, and these little suckers are like their own little plants that come out of these parts where the leaves meet the stem. Okay, now if I let this go and I don't do any pruning, all of these suckers are going to form really big new tomato plants off of this one plant. Just imagine it that way. And what you can actually do is when you remove the suckers, you can actually make new plants. So we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. All right, before we continue on, thanks for joining. We're talking all about tomato pruning. One announcement I want to make is I just released my first ebook. So you can check it out in my bio. It's called Portable Orchards. It's all about growing fruit trees in containers. Check it out. I talk about the 3 keys to successfully growing fruit trees in containers. So go to my bio. It's the top link in my link tree. Download it. Tons of great value. You're going to love it. All right. Thanks for listening. We're back to tomatoes. So tomatoes, we've got this indeterminate tomato. This will grow very, very tall. And I did have a trellis to support it with. I took that off just for the sake of demonstration. And what we're going to do is we want to prune for several different reasons. With tomatoes, if you don't prune, you'll get an overgrown mess that'll eventually do this. It'll just fall over and sort of run along the ground. If you don't stake it up, if you don't prune it, everything's just going to keep growing out of that. You're going to get more of these suckers going into their own plants, and you'll just get this long horizontal mess. And most people want to grow things straight up, right? They want the more space in their garden. They don't want one plant taking up 4 feet of their garden. They just want it taking up its own little spot. So you need to trellis it. Once you do, then you can decide, how do I want this to grow, okay? And you've got a couple different options. But again, back to this indeterminate tomato that we've got. So indeterminates, you really want to train them to 1 or 2 main stems. And what I mean by that is, you can see up here, we've got this is our main stem, and you could let this one go here and it would be a secondary main stem. But if you let all of them go, you're just going to have a big mess. So reasons you want to prune your tomatoes: they're going to taste better. The tomatoes will ripen faster. You're going to get less disease when you prune your tomatoes. So we're talking all about tomatoes. If you've got questions on tomatoes, post them in the comments or the chats below, and we're going to get to some pruning. So what I like to use for pruning my tomatoes are these little snips. And they're really nice because they've got this sharp blade where you can get in. I find full-size pruning shears are sometimes hard to get into those little nooks and crannies, so definitely want to grab yourself a pair of snips if you don't have one. You can also use scissors. They work just as well. When you do prune, the first thing you want to do is you want to prune all the leaves that are touching the ground. You don't want leaves touching the ground, and that's because this leaf right here is how disease is going to spread from the dirt and the ground upwards. So you want that airflow going underneath. So I'm going to actually take off this bottom leaf here because it was almost touching the ground. And then next up, you want to take off, now this is for indeterminate types, all the suckers. And I know that's a lot. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut those off as well. So I've got this little sucker I just took off here. And I've got a couple other ones. I've got this much bigger sucker right here. And this one, and here's a little neat tip for you. You can actually take this sucker, take the bottom parts off like this, stick this in a glass of water, and it'll root into a whole new plant. So you can make more plants. If you've got a long growing season, you're in a warm climate, you can actually root your suckers into entire new cloned plants. So I'm not going to do that today. I've got more than enough tomatoes, so we're just going to toss that for now. All right, so now we've got a little bit better form here. Now, for indeterminate varieties, I need to decide, do I want one main stem or two? And I'm going to keep this as 2 stems here. So you can see these 2 here. And I want that because I've got this, again, this trellis, and I want it to sort of spread near the top, not near the bottom. So I'm going to take off any of these other little suckers that are down below. I've got one right here. If they're really small, you can pinch them with your fingers, but once they get big, you definitely want to use those snips. So pinching with your fingers, you just sort of use your fingernails there, and they're pretty easy to prune those suckers off. All right, so that's indeterminate varieties. Again, I'm going to leave this one sucker here, but I'm going to continue to prune off other suckers. Now for determinate varieties, we are going to go take a look at those here in a second. But any questions before we move away from this indeterminate variety? You do want to stake this up. You want to make sure that it does stay straight up, and I'm probably going to do that here before we transition. So let me see if I can get this thing back in, and then we're going to move. Stand by. This is my new Vigo garden trellis rolling planter extravaganza. All right, so this is going to get pretty tall. Let's move to some indeterminate varieties. And we're moving into the sun, so I apologize if I'm sweating. Okay, we got our first question. Does it matter how many non-sucker leaves you take off? How many non-sucker leaves? I like to take off a lot of non-sucker leaves that are below the first fruit. So that's another thing that you can do, is anything from the ground up to where the first set of flowers and fruit come in, you can really clear all of that off, because what that's going to do is it's going to be shaded out anyway. Those are going to die off. They're not going to be bringing energy into the plant. They're just going to be taking energy. So a lot of times I'll actually prune all the way up to where the first fruit is, and then all those branches and suckers can come off. But for indeterminate, you definitely want to take suckers off continually throughout the whole season. Okay? Great question. All right, next up we've got this determinate. I think this is a determined mess, if you want to call it something, because it sort of is. I've let this go. This is my Roma tomato. It's almost become, yeah, you're welcome for that, almost become a tomato patch more than it's become a tomato plant. Yes, this is all one plant right here. And this is a Roma tomato. And with Romas, they're determinate, meaning that I'm going to get this to grow to a certain height. It's going to get all these fruit. They're all going to become ripe all at once. And that's okay because that's the type that it is. And then you can make sauce because you've got everything ripening all at once. So what I like to do on determinate varieties is to prune off any suckers that you find up to the first fruit and any leaves touching the ground. But then you want to leave all the rest of the suckers. And the reason for that is when you remove those suckers on the determinate varieties, you're actually removing the potential for more fruit. And you want them to be bushy. So again, everything from the ground up to the first fruit, you're going to remove the suckers and then leave those suckers above that point. And that's where it's different between that determinate and indeterminate varieties. The other thing I like to do on determinate varieties, remember the bushy Roma types, is to remove any leaves that are touching the ground. And that's because disease usually splashes off the soil into the leaves and fungal disease sort of works its way up. So I'm actually going to take off and clear off some of this. I need to be careful. I've got a very thorny tomato over here, so I don't want to prick myself. But we're just going to cut off anything that's really like dragging on the ground. And I'm going to get this branch here. And any suckers that are forming below a certain point. So lots of, wow, this has really grown quite a bit. We've got a basil stuck in here, you can see. So I apologize if you can't see it too well. It's pretty sunny today. But yeah, anything really below a certain point, which is that first fruit. And it looks like my first fruit set's about this level right here. So let me see if I can get a little bit better camera angle for you. Okay, so we've got first fruit forming about here. So I'm going to take off any suckers below this point. You can see there's some flowers forming. So this one's good. There's a sucker there, but we've got a few down here below. And I've actually got some fruit already forming down below. I'm sorry, vegetables. I don't know if you consider a tomato a fruit. That's up for debate. So we're going to prune out some of these bottom ones just to give it a little bit more airflow down beneath, because again, you don't want these dragging on the ground. You want some breeze to get through here. That's going to help with fungal disease. I've got some companion plants growing, such as basil. Yeah, so that's looking pretty good. Might have a sucker here I'm going to take off. Again, those are those little growths in between the leaf and the branches. So, what questions do you have on tomatoes? Whew, it's getting hot today. Let me know your questions. Otherwise, we'll continue on with a few more points. Now, I do have a couple other types of tomatoes that I'm growing here. This one is a spoon tomato, and this one has lots of tiny little fruits. I've never grown these before, but they are so small and cute and pretty sweet. But it is an indeterminate variety, and I'm actually letting this one go a little bit, but I am going to prune up that bottom bit and let some of those suckers sort of branch off. I don't want to get too many or it will get out of hand, but we definitely want to take off some of these lower branches and definitely suckers that we don't want to grow. So again, you're pruning for airflow, you're pruning for growth patterns, and you want to make sure that you tie up, especially indeterminate tomatoes. I've got this one tied with this twining method here to this wire. And then once it gets to this point, I actually have another wire, which is like up here, and then I'll tie it to that one. So that's how I transition between them. All right. Wow, it is quite warm today. So appreciate everybody's time. Tomato pruning. We talked about indeterminate varieties. We talked about determinate varieties. We went over the different pruning techniques. What questions do you have? While we're waiting for questions, remember, I do have my ebook. I just launched that, I think it was earlier this week. Portable orchards. So if you want to learn how to grow your own fruit in containers, it's got all kinds of information. A lot of that information actually translates to other types of container growing. So if you're growing in your vegetable garden in containers, a lot of that information translates. So check it out. Make sure you download it. Yep, if there are no other questions, we're going to close it out for today. So I hope you all have a great rest of your Saturday. Thanks for joining. Remember, get yourself a pair of snips if you're pruning your tomatoes. And last thing, stay tuned. I am going to be doing a webinar sometime soon. I'm thinking Thursday, the ABCs of fruit trees, so stay tuned for that. I'll send out more information. The zone that I'm in, I am in 8A here in the Carolinas, so it's quite warm, it gets pretty humid, and you really got to watch out for tomato diseases because they will spread, especially blight in this area. So great question. All right, everybody. Thank you. Have a great rest of your Saturday.